All right, so welcome everyone. We are so glad you could join us for our special 2020 virtual edition of the Cosmopolitanisms series. A huge thank you as always to the Center for supporting our work and to the staff for making this meeting possible. So one of the silver linings of the pandemic, and some days you really have to squint, is the ability to convene across great distances. Thus, today we are able to host Professor Frisch, despite the fact that she is based in Germany, hence our meeting at this uncharacteristically early hour in Los Angeles. So Andrea Frisch is Professor of French at the University of Maryland and has recently also held visiting positions at the Leibniz Universität Hannover and at the Universität Bielefeld in Germany. Her work has been supported by National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Humanities Center, and various research centers in the US and Europe. In 2021 to 22, she will be a fellow at the Hamburg Institute for Advanced Study. Professor Frisch received her PhD in Romance Languages and Literatures from Berkeley in 1996. Her work focuses on literature and historiography of the Protestant Reformation, with special attention to Francophone material, and is particularly notable for its interdisciplinary commitments and nuanced attention to both form and history. Her first book, The Invention of the Eyewitness, Witnessing and Testimony in Early Modern France, which came out from North Carolina Press in 2004, is an interdisciplinary study of the figure of the witness as it undergoes profound transformations in the early modern period, balancing inherited medieval notions with new epistemic understandings. Her second book, Forgetting Differences, Tragedy, Historiography, and the French Wars of Religion, from Edinburgh in 2015, explores the rhetoric of reconciliation in the wake of France's civil wars in the 16th century. Focusing on juridical and theological conceptions of pardon, amnesty, and reconciliation, the book juxtaposes historiographical method and tragic aesthetics in 16th and 17th century France. Current projects include the Library of the Enlightened Ethnographer, which examines the reception of 15th and 16th century European travel literature in 18th century anthropology and ethnography, and Dispassionate Truths, the Rise of Unmemorable History, which tracks the relationship between the memorable and the true, all of those in quotes, in the larger body of early modern European historiography, which I assume today's talk is part of. That talk is entitled Between Fait-divers and Grand Récit, the French Wars of Religion and the Genres of Historiography in the 16th Century. Welcome, Professor Frisch.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara, for inviting me, and Andrew for co-inviting me. Thank you, Jeanette Levere, for making all the organizational things happen. A little different than the organizational things we thought we were going to be doing last year. As Barbara says, it is, very interesting to be able to participate in things all around the world at all hours. So that's the positive side, I guess, of this situation. Nevertheless, I'm really sorry I can't be there with all of you and be able to meet and talk with you also a little bit more outside of the talk. So I'll try not to read too much, but I will read a bit just so I make sure I stay within time constraints. I think it's a little easier to listen to somebody in person kind of go on and riff and chat. But I think we've all had enough Zoom time in the last several months that you'll appreciate it if I get to the point. So I'll try to do that. So as Barbara mentioned, this project, The Rise of Unmemorable History, this material that I'll be talking about is definitely connected to that. And in fact, what I'm hoping to do is to throw out a lot of the kind of big conceptual terms that I've been trying to think through with this project, which is I'm at sort of the late beginning of it. And hopefully get some feedback, some questions, comments to help me sharpen my thinking about it. So I'm going to lay the groundwork for what I see as the problems that I'm investigating. So in the course of researching the book on tragedy in historiography, I read an awful lot of national historiography of the French Wars of Religion from the 16th and 17th century. And what is striking to me about it now, what has come to the fore for this current project, is the tension that I see there between the philological methods of, uh, of humanist historians that were developed and used uh, to address scarce, mostly narrativized, single author texts, these historiographical sources of antiquity. So honing these methods are honed on historiographical texts that already have a certain coherence. And so you have these methods on the one hand, and on the other hand, at the same time, in the 16th century all over Europe, but particularly acute in a situation of conflict, such as the wars of religion, you have an explosion of sources. You have an explosion of source material that is not narrativized, that has several competing perspectives, that's really plentiful. It's an embarrassment of riches, so to speak. So the conditions, the material conditions could not be more different with respect to the conditions upon which philological readings of history and philological historiography was elaborated, created. So that's the groundwork upon which I am starting to ask questions. And let me give you a few more details about how I see that. Starting with some probably fairly obvious observations for anybody who's thought about Renaissance historiography. But this this method that is kind of automatically connected to an already narrativized history. And this includes texts that are incomplete, or certainly the humanists are always complaining that the texts they have are defective in some way. But even those texts, Livy, Palladius, Tacitus, etc., survive in large chunks with large historical arcs and usually extensive introductions that give a moral orientation to the reading. So they're by no means working in the dark. These texts are intact enough to convey a narrative coherence that is clearly a fundamental value of Roman historiography itself. So philologically sound editions aim to build on and solidify that narrative coherence in order to reveal political and moral philosophical wisdom. And what I'm trying to emphasize here is that the character of that available textual evidence allowed this to be fairly successful. It allowed it to happen. It's not too hard to draw morals from an already moralized history. So then there's the contrast to these accounts of current or recent events in the same period, and in which these philological historians are working and talking about their methods. These accounts, by contrast, emanate from multiple and frequently anonymous authors in a variety of media, and they incorporate experiential as well as textual evidence, all different kinds of evidence. The transformation of this kind of corpus into an instructive or even a coherent narrative was not really a job for a philology built for fine-tuning pre-constituted objects. Yet philology stood in learned circles as the best technique for producing reliable histories. So what we have is a method developed in imitation of and for use on one kind of object confronted with a very different kind of object. That's the basic situation. It's really a pretty direct confrontation, in part because a lot of the people who are trying to write histories of contemporary events also did editions of ancient texts and ancient historiography. So they're people that are familiar with this philological method and have used it. So well-known early modern theorists of historiography, such as Jean Bodin, one of the most famous ones, had a sense that their methodologies would falter if applied to current or recent events. Now, Bodin's explanation for the bad fit focused on ethical risk. This is what Bodin says. For those who permit histories of present-day affairs to circulate publicly, it is really difficult to write the truth, lest the report should injure the name of someone or damage his reputation. He writes this in the Methodist method of reading history. And there are a lot of other examples of this, people saying that, well, we really can't talk about the events of the day because it's just too dangerous, too risky. Um, the suggestion here, what Baudin is implying, is that he has the tools to write a perfectly good history of the present. It's just, it's just going to bother some people. It's just a little too risky. So better just to leave it alone. Now, I think, he's probably right about the potential risks of writing contemporary history. But I think there are deeper, more fundamentally methodological difficulties with writing that history that Baudin is avoiding, failing to see. So in 16th century France, as I said, the public records, this is the kind of phrase Baudin uses, you need to consult the public records. The public records upon which Baudin believed sound history depended were not rare, but copious and subject to unrelenting dispute. We should therefore consider the possibility that just as Baudin, keep in mind that just as Baudin was elaborating this method, at the same time, a large, and I would say for the first time, a large and diverse group of interested observers was getting a glimpse into how the historiographical sausage was made from the ground up. In order to appreciate the challenge for philological method, I think we have to contrast the chaos of material published during the French Wars of Religion to the relatively restricted number of sources, the accumulated authority of the ancient historiographers, and the consensus about Rome's historical importance, for example, the object, that made classical philology possible. In other words, there's sort of a stacked deck for philological method, and this confrontation with contemporary history kind of brings that into relief. Once the methods that philologists have developed to enhance textual accuracy and presumably to get closer to the truth conveyed by historiography, once these methods were untethered from the narratively coherent and widely authoritative material in relation to which they had been developed and upon which their perceived success had depended, many philologists recoiled and withdrew behind this pretext that Baudin offered. That is, it's just too risky. So the title I propose, there are, of course, then lots of different aspects to this tension and to this clash that I'm trying to look at. So the title I proposed, I could have proposed some different ones, but proposes a first set of terms that for thinking about this challenge of writing a philologically sound history of the present. So the fait-divers and the I guess I said grand récit and not, grand récit. So despite the way I said it in the title, from fait-divers to grand récit, I'm not proposing some kind of historical evolution, a linear evolution along those lines. But more a constant back and forth tension between those poles of disjointed facts. What I use the term fait-divers, it's a 19th century term. It doesn't come from that period, but it's meant to evoke the way in which people like Barthes have characterized the fait-divers, something that's disconnected from a narrative history. So fait-divers and larger narrative, I think there's this constant tension happening very explicitly in this period. Now, the tension is kind of a fundamental one in philological research itself, especially as it kind of tends more and more towards the antiquarian. That's the kind of the horizon of philological research. In fact, I found it helpful to relate the notion of the fait-divers, or the kind of bare fact, to that quintessentially philological pursuit, antiquarianism. Both are concerned with small bits of information, and this word information I have problems with, but I don't quite know what else to use right now. But fait-divers and antiquarianism are both concerned with small bits of history, information, that stake a claim to be authentic, true, worthy of attention, but that are not, or at least not yet, integrated into any widely accepted shared narrative. And I find really productive Rebecca Gould's suggestion that antiquarianism can also be described as a form of attention paid specifically to, and this is a quote from her, the obscure, the forgotten, the oppressed, and the otherwise unassimilated. So that this opens up this idea of the detached fact to a lot of other kinds of related terms. Once we think about antiquarianism this way, we can see that antiquarian attention can be focused on either the past or the present. It's not limited to the past. It's more a term of alienation, let's say. And it's a term that allows us to point to anything that a dominant narrative or perhaps narrative itself leaves out in a way that can be linked. And this is what Rebecca Gould does when she's talking about this antiquarian philology, in a way that can be linked to Foucault's genealogical method. So looking at that, which the main narratives of history have left out. Now, the 16th century historians that I focus on, and I'll show you a couple slides later from two of those works, gathered evidence in accordance with the latest philological methods. So they follow the rules, all the rules that Baudin sets out: firsthand sources, earliest versions, multiple witnesses. So they weren't just writing beaux récits, these kind of much denigrated medieval stories that the philologists were rejecting. They were using these methods, but they didn't. They appeared to feel they could not winnow these sources down to what they could fit into could shape into a coherent narrative addressed to a national audience. So I see this not as a problem of ethical risk, as Baudin defined it, so much as a clash of historiographical methods. The antiquarianism of the fact gatherer, which was supposed to serve as the methodological guarantor of scrupulous accuracy, works against the synthesizing, meaning-making reductionism of narrative historiography, as it was inherited from both classical and medieval predecessors by the philological historians of the Renaissance. Now, this description, this clash between a lot of information and the inability to shape it, might remind you of Anne Blair's book, Too Much to Know. She describes her objects of study, and she's not talking about history or historiography. She's talking about knowledge, which is a little bit different, but the way she characterizes these objects that become too much, they get stored then, and this is Blair, in collections of notes that are valued as treasuries of storehouses in which to accumulate information, even if they did not serve an immediate purpose. End of quote. So there's this purposelessness to this information that's being collected, which obviously is something that historiographical account doesn't really tolerate. So this is why when Blair characterizes her material as so much scholarly information, we see that this, if we're heading in this direction, we're getting further and further away from anything that's resembling narrative historiography. So once philologists back in the historiographical context are not working on pre-constituted narratives, such as the rise and fall of Rome or something like that, the products of their erudition are destined to gather dust in storehouses. This is what Blair is describing. Not really outside of history, but not integrated into it either. But before that happens, so this is the sort of horizon of philology as antiquarianism. Before that happens, and this is my first kind of hypothesis in this project, the prestige of philology in 16th century France, let's say for now, will push other ways of approaching the past to a more marginal position. I evoke these terms of the memorable and the true. The memorable is going to be very critical in what follows. I'm not happy with the word true, and it won't really come up here. I'll try to talk about it in a slightly different way. But the tension between a method for maximizing historical accuracy on the one hand, and a need, or at least a habit, of extracting meaning from history. So the tension between these crystalline facts and the grand récit is at the heart of the works that I focus on, most of which were first published in the 1570s, 80s, and 90s, and most of them, expanded several times after that. So I'm just going to show you a couple of these. I'll share my screen so you can get a sense of what they look like. I don't need the audio, so hopefully this will, can you see that? You guys see that? Good. This first text, the Recueil des choses mémorables de Jean de Serres, this is a 1603 edition, but it's first published in 1595. What we have here, it's a good example of one way in which this historiography is presented and organized. This is just it's a multi-volume, chronological, highly detailed account of, as you can see on the cover here, basically 1550 to 1598. So it's less than 50 years, covers less than 50 years. And oh, I guess he's got the years on there too. I didn't see that. But it's a relatively short time period, certainly much shorter than the rise and fall of the period covered. Well, I guess by Livy, that might be a little closer to that, but shorter than the period covered by Polybius or something like that, but much longer and much more detailed. So we have much more information in here, and it's just simply chronologically organized. It's not really integrated into any other historical framework. And one of the noticeable characteristics of it, or notable, I would say, is it gets composed by a process of accretion rather than this process of winnowing that I was associating with philological history that tries to cut things down to the most accurate rendering that can be found in the texts. Here, it's a question of accumulating as much historical information, I guess I'll call it. Again, I'm looking for help talking about how to characterize this pre-narrativized or non-narrativized material, historical material. And also this kind of principle of accretion, always adding and pretty much rarely correcting, because it's often all firsthand sources, and sometimes also eyewitness testimony, eyewitness experience of the historian. And so there's very little correction to be done, in the sense that you already have the original version. I think for me invites some reflection on how something like the essay of Montaigne might be related to this kind of writing, and participate in something a bit larger than, Montaigne has been definitely integrated into juridical writing and ways of looking at cases and talking about cases, but he's not usually looked at in conjunction with history writing. And I think there's definitely some reflection to be done there in terms of that kind of skepticism, perhaps, that we associate with Montaigne being imported into historiography. So we have this kind of unfinished nature of the text that's always being added to, a kind of a lack of narrative frame, just a kind of a strict chronology. Kind of reminds us of the way Hayden White characterized the annals, contrasting to the narrative historiography of the 19th century. So it's just kind of time unfolding, and you fill up that time according to the historiographical material you have, which is obviously plentiful in this situation. Another thing Serres does, and this you see in several works of the period, is turn to the reader to say, well, I'm not going to judge this. I'm not going to kind of draw a conclusion from this. I'm going to leave this up to you, the reader. So it's another way that this is left open. Even, I would say, more acute, maybe, or more explicit, is Simon Boulard, his Mémoire de l'État de France sous Charles IX. Can't quite see the slide myself here. This, as you can see, I gave you a little excerpt from the table of contents. This is basically just a collection of documents. This is the work around which Robert Kingdon wrote his book, Myths about the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. He studied this as a way to talk about the impact of print on public opinion and political theory during the Wars of Religion. So he really looked at the content and I suppose the mediation in terms of print, but he didn't really look too much at the rhetoric and presentation in terms of a historiographical method. So here we have, all of these documents that in other, I think in other European countries at this time, and certainly, the way current scholarship is looking back at this material, would be classified as news. So there's a lot of work going on now about news in the 16th century and beyond. But the interesting time now is the 16th century before the advent of periodicals. We have these news pamphlets circulating what is news. And there's not a lot done in France because there really isn't a lot of news in France. Instead, and this is another thing I think that could be pursued here in this project. It's one of the kind of sub ideas I had. News is consistently framed in terms of historiography and history. So it's not just left out there as news. It has this kind of pretension to being history. And this is certainly how Goulart, who put all this together, frames this collection. He frames it as not just history, but instructive history that will teach virtue. So you just have this dump of documents, but he's still, aiming to get some kind of moral payoff from this. Now, Goulart was a classical scholar himself. He edited Plutarch. I forgot what else he did, but he's somebody who had ample experience in textual editing and philological classical scholarship. But it's very interesting in his preface, you see that he seems to have learned very different lessons from that experience than the ones that Baudin proposed. So I'll go ahead and shut this now. Let's see here. Goulart, some people, Goulart writes, and this is in his preface to the memoir, that because accounts of contemporary history are frequently contradictory or mistaken, given how hard it is to take account of everything. This is Goulart talking. So some people think because of that, because they're often pretty confusing, that it's better to defer writing the history of the present, or to give up on the enterprise altogether. But Goulart is not convinced. He says, si le délai apporte toujours lumière de vérité, je ne condamne pas cet avis, which means if it really did get easier to know the truth, after more time passes, the further you get from it. He then, analogizes this to somebody who's looking off in the distance and trips in a ditch that's right in front of him. So if it really did get easier to know the truth, if the truth appeared in a clearer light, the further you got from it, then he would agree with this, that you shouldn't, you should wait and you shouldn't write contemporary history. But then he goes on to point out that actually, the past frequently fades behind subsequent events. And so that if you think a present event is digne de mémoire, memorable, then you should record it and preserve it as soon as you possibly can. Now, this is obviously a lesson that it seems to me any classical scholar could have figured out, because it basically encapsulates the philological critique of memorable history. That is that there are always these accretions and these new versions that are covering up the original truth. And this is just what Goulart was arguing, which he's saying this is why we need to write the history of the present now. But for political reasons, it seems to me, this is not the view taken up in works like Baudin's. Goulart goes on to explain that readers should not be overly picky if some small details are incorrect, as long as the larger arc of events is fairly represented. And he points out, in order to kind of justify this, that even the best Latin and Greek historians worked from divers mémoires et traités écrits et publiés auparavant. So he's explaining here that classical history was written in precisely the same way he proposes to write the history of his own times. Behind the lovely narrative veneer of Livy and Polybius lay a welter of sources that the modern philologist simply never had access to, and so forgets to factor in to his account of historiographical method. So he's kind of exposing this idealization of the antique sources, the classical sources, and saying, you know, this is, as I said before, how the historiographical sausage is made. And here again, I would say the argument has considerable merit. It's pretty clear that this is a lesson you could learn from the encounter with classical history, particularly in the context where you see a proliferation of sources. So the argument throws into question the textual, Goulart throws into question the textual foundation upon which philological inquiry rested by highlighting the blind spots of philological inquiry, that is, ignoring the constructedness of these original texts. So still in the preface, Goulart attributes what some might consider a sensationalist style, and he's kind of known for this sensationalist style. He attributes this to the sensational nature of the events themselves. How else to talk about the murder of helpless old people, women, children, and here's a quote I translated, tiny innocents still in their mother's womb, whose hands reached out through the opening made by the murderer's dagger to implore God for vengeance. How else to talk about those things than in that way? This is right in the preface. Goulart's emotional and spiritual investment in material is crystal clear here, but just as clear is that he is faithfully recording what he has found in Baudin's public record. So I don't think we can just go right on in saying this is a mendacious or false account of history. So the fundamental task these works are addressing, the Serre and Goulart and others like them, is how to assimilate contemporary history into history in the larger sense, especially since scholarly attention to a select set of highly narrativized histories from antiquity has created what can only be characterized as unrealistic and, as Goulart points out, unfounded expectations for contemporary historiography. So this leads to the second set of terms that I've found helpful in structuring my thinking about what is at stake in the way in which these works are written and received in 16th and 17th century France. So I've already mentioned the histoire mémorable and the notion of the mémorable. In addition to promising some sort of moral coherence, the term mémorable, when applied to a history or an event, advertises consensus and continuity. Even as what it labels might be, empirically speaking, stitched together from all sorts of contingent interventions and modifications. So I'm talking about its rhetorical force and its intent here. The use of the term mémorable in medieval and early modern historiography consolidates and naturalizes the implicit presumption of a shared ethical context, and therefore a shared sense of what is true. So if memorable history certainly insists on its own utility, it does not devote much time arguing for its veracity, which is framed as a given. I want to emphasize here that there's no inherent antagonism between the memorable and the true, and none is posited in works of memorable history. Instead, what the designation memorable does, mémorable, is to sort out relevant and meaningful true things from irrelevant but perhaps equally true things. Indeed, the hallmark of the traditional notion of digne de mémoire, which we have versions in all the European languages, is its selectivity. It leaves a lot out by design. The rest of the past could safely be forgotten. There was no need to develop a historiographical theory about material that fell outside the bounds of what was digne de mémoire. And you see passages like this wonderful one from Nicolas Vignier, who was an historiographe du roi in the 1570s, not one of the innovative ones, who in his chronicle repeats an old chestnut about Louis le Fainéant, King Louis the Lazy. Louis le Fainéant was so called because during his reign, he didn't do anything digne de mémoire. And so he's not going to be included in this chronicle. The fact that he's excluded from the book both confirms and perpetuates that evaluation. So, and there's lots of examples of that. This is just not digne de mémoire, so we pass over it. And there's no further discussion, and there's no theory about that, and there's no place for that material to go. It just disappears. Several practices help sustain this sense of the memorable, so that which is worth keeping. But again, taken to be true. So I don't want to set it in in opposition to the truth, at least not yet, because I think that's what's going to be happening. But it's important to appreciate the fact that this isn't part of the original sense. So there are a lot of practices that help sustain the sense of the memorable on through the period that I'm talking about. We know that a significant amount of printed material in 16th and 17th century Europe was recycled, reused, or otherwise readapted. A phenomenon that media studies scholars call remediation. Certainly anonymous publication, and I mentioned that a little in the abstract, but I'm not going to talk too much about that except in this very conceptual sense here. So certainly anonymous publication and the relative speed of production in the first centuries of print encouraged and facilitated this phenomenon. So the kind of taking up and reusing of pre-existing material. So remembering it and also perpetuating the memory of it. But we should also remember the fact that such recycling was the mainstay of medieval historiography, and also one of the central practices of Renaissance literary composition. From this perspective, characterizing a historical report as mémorable and memorable was already a form of justification, legitimation, justification for its repetition and propagation in a range of forms and versions that could be adapted for a variety of audiences. So this is a very powerful way to characterize information, let's say, as mémorable. Mary Carruthers has emphasized the creative aspect of monastic appropriations of the art of memory, asserting that medieval recollection is a kind of composition. This is what she says. And the way she describes this sounds a lot like theories of both of medieval historiography and medieval literature. Some of you might remember this is from the 70s, Paul Zumthor's Mouvance, so the way in which different manuscript versions of medieval material will be generated, even though the text in question is considered to be the same. And Bernard Secchi-Guigny proposed the term variance to describe scribal alterations within a purely written tradition. So mouvance and variance are kind of the literary equivalents of this creative remembering or creative reproduction, let's call it. So this helps us see the degree to which material that was considered worthy of memory in the Middle Ages was open to modification as it circulated over time and space. So this is a very important inheritance that comes into Renaissance historiography, and that philological method is responding to. So whereas creative remembering accepts variation and departure from a source, even though it's conceived as an act of preservation, philology comes now as the contrast, styles itself as a technique of restoration. So we have preservation versus restoration here. Philology styles itself as a technique of restoration, as a method that aims precisely to recover that which has been forgotten. So it's almost a flip side of this memorable. It's trying to get behind what has the memorable left out. At least that's the kind of self-characterization and postulate. So we could say, I realize the sentence has all these French words. Mouvance and variance are the bête noire of the philological historian, but they're also his raison d'être. For the philologist historian, it was only after a process of critical textual evaluation had been successfully undertaken that one could begin to look for guidance on questions of civic law, ecclesiastical legitimacy, or moral philosophy in the matter of history. So you first had to correct the text. In order to interpret it, the philologist first had to render a verdict on its truth value, at least as a text. Now again, truth value, accuracy, I'm going to want some help thinking about how to talk about that. But this truth value or accuracy was determined via a process of winnowing. I've already mentioned this for philologists. So because it's a process of winnowing, creative variants are no longer attached to an idea of preservation, but the opposite. The only way to preserve something is to return it to a very narrow historical context of origin. This led humanists to promote the memory of a putative original object over and against the memory conveyed by and through traditions of transmission that they no longer saw as serving a preservative function. So humanists see this activity very differently. From a philological perspective, the creative dimension, or the philologists, not the humanists, from a philological perspective, the creative dimension of consensual memory appeared to compromise rather than to enhance the ethical potency of historical material. So that which was truly worthy of memory was to be sought in a historically circumscribed inaugural moment that had to be exhumed rather than in the living body of the traditions by and through which that moment had been conveyed. And I think that, that view of philology as kind of working on dead objects has been pretty well elaborated. But here's where we can connect it up to the pursuits of the historians that I'm looking at. So if the epithet mémorable, memorable, the way it's conceived, it's inextricably bound up with practices of extension and elaboration. Philology, on the other hand, is predicated on a method of correction. So we have these two very different values, let's say, and then also practices of generating texts. This fundamental contrast brings several other distinctions along with it that seem to me to be important for thinking about the situation of the 16th century historiographer. Memorable history is as at home in the present and the future as it is in the past. The genre has no trouble accommodating new amplifications that add to the stock of items that should be remembered. And this is in part because it has a kind of a natural limitation in that which is forgettable. It lets that go. So there's always the opportunity, as I was saying, in this creative remembering, to reshape the material of the memorable in such a way that it can accommodate new material. Philology, by contrast, trains its sights on the past, pretty much exclusively, and as a technique of correction, kind of paradoxically allows for the recovery of forgotten material, but then also solicits the forgetting of remembered material, because you're correcting something, so you have to get rid of what you had known or remembered, what you thought was memorable. Another contrast, memorable history freely indulges in the rhetorical techniques of the arts of memory, helping weak human minds grasp and hold the truth it imparts. And this is all part of this creative remembering. Carruthers talks about it quite a bit in relation to the art of memory, that, this is part of what the function of the art of memory is to preserve. But again, we have these elaborate techniques of rhetoric that help us retain. Philology eschews such rhetorical pyrotechnics by positing that they're one of the biggest obstacles to accuracy, rather than a privileged vehicle for conveying truth. The ideological alliance of memory with a consensual notion of truth allows memorable history simply to omit what it finds irrelevant to its ethical aims. The philological notion of truth as a product, so truth or accuracy as a product of correction, is by contrast adversarial. It says explicitly that this thing is true and that other thing is false. Whereas again, in the rhetoric of the memorable, the forgotten is just not addressed. So we don't have this explicitly adversarial kind of method. So another of my hypotheses so far is that the confrontation between philological method and the writing of contemporary history during the period of the Wars of Religion in France led to the emergence of stronger claims for a distinction between memorable history and philologically sound history, but not, and so this is, where I hope I'm contributing a different perspective, not as a step towards better history writing, but as the result of the ways in which practices of historiography were embedded in social conflicts. As directly and strongly competing, as meaning at the time that directly and strongly competing claims about what is worthy of memory more or less immediately confronted one another, the antagonistic context disrupts the tacit consensus that underlay the rhetoric of memorable history, thereby bringing the constructedness of the memorable into view. So obviously, the memorable is a construct, it's choices, there's nothing natural about it. But as long as it's consensual, this isn't a problem. Once it's not consensual, the kind of artificiality of that comes into view. And this, by bringing this constructedness of the memorable into view, it opens up memorable history, which was the primary form of history, to the charges. So it opens up to the charges of being partial, partisan, and in the most extreme cases, simply false. Now, by virtue of characterizing their methods as contrary to those of memorable history, so I think it's important to trace and hopefully to bolster this case of philology defining itself in contradistinction to memorable history. By doing that, by defining itself as against memorable history, I think philologists and pseudo-philologists of the time pretended that they thereby avoided the pitfalls of being partial, partisan, and false, which they accused memorable history of doing. Obviously this isn't true. Philological method can be just as partial and mistaken and partisan and all those kinds of things. But this, the kind of confluence of circumstances allowed those accusations to be lobbed at memorable history. Philological history could then distinguish itself from that. Now, I think there are other factors that contributed to the erosion of the prestige of memorable history in early modern France. And my book about Forgetting Differences talks about some of this. Certainly, discourses of reconciliation promoted by the crown after the wars, the famous first line of the Edict of Nantes, que la mémoire, that the memory of everything that happened be erased. This kind of political rhetoric served to position memory, not history, not truth, but memory, que la mémoire soit effacée, memory as divisive and partisan. So memory gets also kind of saddled with that responsibility. Exacerbating this is the additional fact that, as we saw in the case of Saint-Goulard, minority Huguenots were mostly the ones writing the histories of the wars. So gathering these historical documents. And they were also usually casting it as memorable history. So they were also using this vocabulary of memorable history, which further served to associate memory with partisanship, even as I said, many of them were using very good philological methods. They just weren't applying them to classical text. Nonetheless, their lingering association with memory allowed memory, I think, to be associated in turn with partisanship. And this is where I'm going out on a limb a little bit, but I think I see in Catholic historians of the wars, and again, I'm talking about national historians, so historians that are trying to address the French community as a whole, and not a subgroup, an in-group. It has to be across kind of adversarial lines for this to make sense. But and this is where the word truth comes in. Catholic historians are, at least sometimes, and I just don't know how widespread this is, kind of assimilating their claim to theological truth to a claim to historiographical truth. So to be able to kind of transfer that truth claim based in a theological stance or claim to a historiographical authority. But Huguenot historians of the same period hewed more closely to the traditional historiographical rhetoric of memory and memorability. And then on top of that, another dimension of this, which we already saw in Glut, in the most, probably the most overtly partisan accounts, and the best example are martyrologies, Protestant martyrologies, the exploitation of rhetorical techniques of memorable presentation, so this kind of art of memory stuff, made the material vulnerable to the charge that it was not true because it's so completely over the top, this sensational kind of writing. Now, here again, I want to insist that there is no inherent antagonism between any of these techniques of the memorable and truth or true history or accurate history. The perception of such an antagonism is, I'm suggesting, the product of specific historical circumstances. So I'm coming to the end here to see where this is going, where this kind of ends up, where I see it ending up once we look at this relationship in this way, a little bit more from the perspective of memory rather than from the perspective of a rise and triumph of philology. As most of us know, the 17th and 18th centuries saw the elaboration of ever more intricate claims to impartiality. So this is where historiographical, scientific historiography is going. And these are that, the kind of study of impartiality is pretty well developed, I think, in existing scholarship. But this also includes a very specific framework for impartiality in scientific historiography that I think is a legacy from this time. The less directly it depended on any account of current affairs, the more disinterested and thus philologically sound it could claim to be, or impartial, let's say. In other words, this is how I see this. This is how I translate this in terms related to the origins of classical scholarship and philology. There was an increasingly dominant tendency to recast the distance between the producers and consumers of historiography on the one hand and history on the other, the sources, let's call them, to recast this not as where it started, the frustrating alienation of the classical scholars scavenging for lost manuscripts. So this distance is kind of an empirical fact for the classical scholar that has to be overcome in some way, but can't be, of course. But this distance, which is really just empirical and contingent, is recast as a necessary criterion for sound historical scholarship. The contingent position of the philologist becomes valorized as the only legitimate perspective for the truth seeker or the accuracy seeker, let's say. So one thing that comes out of this moment is a deprivileging of memory in the memorable by its association to a minority community whose beliefs are held by the majority to be false and who can't write a history of the struggle that reads like Livy, basically. What was previously a genre of consensus par excellence, the histoire mémorable, was recast as an instrument of partisanship and accused of basically falseness. In conjunction with this, scientific history gradually rejects many of the rhetorical attributes of the memorable over the course of the 16th century, 16th and 17th centuries. And it's only recently that I started thinking about this in terms of what that kind of history then gives up by kind of renouncing this alliance with memory and memorability. So where I see this heading in a longer term is that scholarly history written by the winners, the philological winners, becomes ever more detached from public life. Memorable histories, meanwhile, persist, jealously guarded by their communities, all the more so when those communities do not feel addressed by scholarly history. And the question of address is the last big area that the project focuses on, and I'll be happy to say more about that if people are interested, because I think it's a really important part of this dynamic. But I think I've thrown out enough kind of sweeping claims for now, and asked for enough of your attention that I will stop and hear what you have to say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrea, for that incredibly rich presentation. I think what we will do is we will ask all those in attendance to write your questions in the Q&A, and Andrew or I will read them to Andrea and allow her to answer them. And I think we already have one question. This is from Jean-Claude Caron, who says, hello, Andrea. Would you then say that works by historians like Dessert or Goulart essentially aimed at producing or anthologizing selective documents to serve and, quote, influence future historians, creating a partisan, quote unquote, memory for their use?
Okay. I say that, yes, they do that. But I think what I was trying to point out is that philological historians working on material from Roman history don't seem to realize that that is also what happens when Roman history gets written. So that step, Goulart is saying, yes, I am doing that, and I have a limited point of view, but I have access to all this firsthand information. We have to save it. I'm doing that, but that's exactly what the best Latin and Greek historians, this is that quote I mentioned from the preface, the best Latin and Greek historians have always done. So it's a false contrast with philological method proposes a false contrast when it focuses on that, this partisanship or partiality.
Thank you. I will read another one, and again, they are streaming in. So Stanley Wu, who's a graduate student at UCLA in English, says, thank you for your talk. Could you expand on the ideological basis for the Protestant Catholic denominational divide in preferences for antiquarianism versus philological history? For example, how much is the Huguenot affinity for memorable history a product of theological positions versus status as a minority community?
That's a good question. I've been going back and forth with this because, obviously in a lot of ways, you can think of Protestant church history very much in line with philological scholarship, that it's, trying to return to this lost moment of theological origin that needs to be recovered. So, in that respect, it's kind of puzzling that this memorable history becomes so important and so prominent in the Protestant historiographical writing of the time. Now, one reason I see that it does happen is because the something I mentioned really quickly and probably didn't explain well enough is this idea that memorable, the term memorable, really, if anything, is directed towards the future. So if you're calling something memorable, you're saying this is to be remembered, this should be remembered. Uh, and when we talk about an inheritance, we can say, well, this stuff obviously is memorable because it was remembered, but the way we see it being used in the Protestant, maybe slightly polemical material, historiographical material of the period is, this is memorable. You should not forget it. You need to keep it. And so in that sense, maybe the question was, is it more of a product of minority status? Maybe, but I think the attachment of memorability to specifically minority status is something that happens outside the control of the Protestant community, because previous to that, this is a term that binds community together. It does not designate a minority community. So it's a really good question, and I've been asking myself a lot about Protestant church history and how I'm going to integrate that into this thinking.
I wonder if I could jump in. I mean, in relation to that question, I found myself thinking also about what notion of agency is implied in the different forms of writing history, and it seems to me, I mean, it's complicated, right? Because the memory that is being invoked is somehow communal and really not one person's memory, but in fact, there's a kind of atomization, right, of several instances of interventions, right, into the history, and saying this is memorable and so on. Whereas the other sort of is more structural, right, in a sense, right? You go back, you're doing away with things so you can go back to what is actually the official story, right? And so in that sense, I wonder if there might be some correlation with a Protestant focus on the ability for the individual subject to intervene, even if it's only as a conduit for that memory that comes from before and, as you pointed out, goes into the future. I'm not sure if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I see what you're saying. I'm just not sure. Yeah, the sense of individual agency and intervention. I think that individual agency and intervention, for me, starts to consolidate this more and more as a minority, a minority kind of position, in the sense that this is something that isn't going to happen without you, because the forces are against it happening. So you need to intervene. You need to act. Yeah, I don't know. That's definitely on the burner.
Andrew, do you want to read some of these as well? Or I can keep reading. So from William Reddy, we have really interesting and informative. How do you see these works in relation to eschatological visions of the wars and or providential understandings? What relation to de Thou, author of the preamble to the Edict of Nantes?
Well, it's interesting because this future directedness that I'm talking about, and probably the person who asked the question picked up on this, and that's why they're asking about eschatological vision, and because for a while, a lot of Protestant thinking is oriented towards, well, Catholic thinking too, but from slightly earlier time is oriented towards the idea that the end times are coming. So this open-endedness has an end, a postulated end, and that postulated end is believed to be not too far in the future. So in a way, this structure of what I was calling open-endedness or skepticism is really just a kind of a brief suspension and a time of waiting, of patience, but the end is near in a positive sense. And that's an interesting point of reference for tracking this historiography on into the 17th century, and especially once you get to somebody like Andrea d'Aubigné, who wrote just after de Thou, but who is obviously dealing with the kind of fallout of still being in secular time and still trying to make sense of this history without now that kind of endpoint as a point of reference from which to structure a possibility of uncertainty or waiting. So there's now it seems much more open-ended. I suppose in the sense that the way some people talk about historical consciousness at the time, then becoming much more open-ended and not structured by an end. Yeah, so de Thou, well, de Thou is somebody who, this I would put de Thou in a discussion of address, which I mentioned at the end, which is de Thou is addressing, it's pretty interesting because he's addressing more than anything an international public with his history of his times, written in Latin, and sent to, kind of humanist luminaries outside of France. So, I'm really trying to come to terms with vernacular material that's addressed to a broader public. So in that sense, I'm sympathetic to Kingdon's approach of looking at material that somehow is bound up with public opinion, but not necessarily looking at it merely in terms of public opinion. But what I'm trying to get at is his history that is addressed to the present. And I think de Thou's history is addressed to the future and to posterity. So, I could say a little more about that, but that's sort of my answer. So that's posterity in the future and open-endedness as sort of an alibi, a way to write history without without a present addressee.
We have another question here from Julie Hayes, and she says, "Hi, Andrea. I wonder if you might say more about how historians of either camp deal with the injunction to forget, principled forgetting, oblivion. I'm thinking of your earlier work, of course. Do they take on the issue directly?"
Yeah, a lot of them do. And, I have to say that the ones that discuss it often use this alibi of posterity. So the idea is this is not memorable history in the sense of you should remember it. It's memorable history in the sense that it should be saved for a future time. So there's this real explicit distancing from present reception. And in fact, Baudin says that too. He says, if you're gonna do anything, if you're gonna get involved with the present at all, it's pretty much the only other thing he says about contemporary history. Just be safe and direct your work to posterity. And there's some other historians who do that as well, who say, okay, I'm gonna dive in and try to write this history of the present, but it's not for the present to read. It has to be read in the future. So it's another form of this distance that I was talking about, this, naturalizing, or not naturalizing, but kind of arguing for a methodological necessity of distance between either the historian and the material, in the case of like the classical scholar, or the historian and his addressee, in the case of the contemporary material.
So we have a question from Melina Stefanovska, who says, thank you for all these ideas. You said that 17th century historiography claimed impartiality. Where do you place the often oppositional genre of memoir that claimed that absolutist history was partial? Would you place oppositional memoir within memorable history?
Yeah, I would. And it's interesting because, you know, once you get into the 17th century, you have, you know, you do have a lot of narrative history. It's basically propagandistic history, which is, I think, a separate category that I haven't, you know, mentioned here and really dealt with. But it's interesting that you bring up the memoirs, because I think this is part of what sticks in terms of this kind of embattled status of the memorable in memory coming out of the period of the wars. Is I do think of, yes, the memoirs as part of this, let's call it antiquarian in that broad sense, antiquarian, oppositional, maybe even secret in some cases, ways of recording and relating to the past.
We have a question here from Raphael Burns, who says, thank you for this very stimulating talk. I wonder what role the popularity of more fictional genres, such as the histoire tragique in France, that relied heavily on notions of truth and the memorable, while often being very sensationalist and partisan, might have had on the changing prestige of memorable history in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, those works, it's true that, and here it's interesting, or kind of difficult or necessary to think about the vectors of influence or causality, or what, you know, what's happening first here, in the sense of, you know, memorable is always, really always associated to moral instruction. And that's what you have in those histoires tragiques. You know, you always have some moral instruction with them. And, you know, as the questioner mentioned, those are said to be true. So again, we have this alliance of the memorable and the true. Now that those get eventually classified as fiction, maybe that's, you know, that's the question to ask. Again, you know, what I'm sort of playing with here is which comes first. But that those get increasingly received as fiction. I don't know how much they're received as fiction in the early 17th century, or in the 16th century. You know, the earlier versions of those from Rosset and the cosmographer, what's his name? The other guy who wrote the Histoire tragique. So, you know, it could be that it's in retrospect that those genres become classified as fictional after these processes happen. But yeah, there's definitely a relationship there.
Thank you. Andrea, do you have any questions? We've been very good at just channeling all of these questions from the audience. You seem to have hit a lot of interesting topics here that have really sparked a lot of interest.
Oh God,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, you know, I have either, you know, not any coherent question and lots of different swirling ideas. So let somebody speak with it.
I was curious, there's this sort of juxtaposition in your talk between the Fait-divers and the grand récit. And I was wondering, are there any theorists or writers in the 16th or 17th century, 16th century really I'm thinking of, who look at this notion of temporal distance or temporal proximity, and who write about the Fait-divers as perhaps lacking some sort of narrative coherence now, or at least, you know, apparently lacking some narrative coherence now, but perhaps with time and distance, that a more narrative coherence or more importance might be discernible surrounding those Fait-divers. And therefore they're worth keeping because they're sort of, their position might be that at the moment they're recognized as fait-divers, but they might become part of a grand récit of a very different sort of history 100 years from now in the future. In other words, I'm just wondering about this juxtaposition. Are there writers who are seeing them in less juxtapositional terms?
Well, certainly somebody like Serre or Goulart, the two historians whose work I showed, are arguing for the importance of saving bits, and whether fait-divers is the best word for that, I don't know, but I think it captures, the way it's used subsequently. It captures a lot of aspects of this material. That these should be saved, yes, but I think their practice and also their own kind of theoretical statements in their prefaces suggest that it will be part of something more coherent, whether it's a grand récit or not. But I think that's exactly the horizon that they're postulating. So in a lot of ways, another way to kind of re-describe what I was saying, you could see that them as seeing themselves situated at a different spot along a continuum, on which, from Goulart's perspective, all his historiographical knowledge or historical knowledge proceeds from fait-divers to some kind of coherence. That coherence is never immediately inbuilt or something like that. It's not a. But I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, I think, that's exactly what I was getting at. The idea that that with temporal distance, you noted that Goulart argues that, with temporal distance, there can be accreted versions of a particular story that actually obscure the truth, but that perhaps also a certain coherence or narrative might become more visible or apparent with.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Well, I think, yeah, that is the idea is that coherence is a horizon, but I would call it perpetually deferred. So it's probably not as concrete as I was just making it sound. Now that I hear you ask that again.
Well, and there's a sort of follow-up question, I think, from Jean-Claude Caron, who asks, would fait-divers become documents for the future? Which I think is an interesting corollary to what you've been discussing.
Yeah. And another interesting thing about this, and this is kind of also related to the Library of the Enlightened Ethnographer, is the way in which these sources that are so kind of polemical and minority in the 16th century get picked up then in the 19th century. Those are the archives. Then those are the objects of philological inquiry for somebody like Michelet, who then go mine these things for the kind of true history of the 16th century. So empirically, that is what happens. Theoretically, I think they do retain this more open structure, which is that coherence can only be imposed artificially. I think is pretty much.
Well, and Marina Stefanowska makes another point, which I think also relates to this. She says, have you thought about using the notion of anecdotes, which touches on fait-divers at times, and also is a very popular genre, and especially at the beginning meant unpublished, hitherto ignored histories? Of course, anecdotes are bits and pieces of any grand récit.
Yeah. The thing is, it's very important for this project that I'm talking about things that are published and accessible, but received in different ways. And as I mentioned, there's going to be a large kind of part of this devoted to the question of address. And I think one thing an anecdote lacks, this idea of unpublished, is it doesn't really have an address. And the different addressees, implicit implicit addressees of these different kinds of history is an important element of these contrasts. So yeah, so I think the anecdote probably won't fit into this one.
So I wanted to ask you about a couple of things, and this comes from my thinking much more, obviously, about Spain. I know much less about historiography in France, so feel free to ignore if this is not useful. So you do seem to be focusing on the national, but I'm wondering if local histories are one place to look for sort of a different weight given to these things. And I'm thinking about some of the work that Richard Kagan has done on choreography in Spain as, you know, an alternative way of writing history. So that's one. And then the other is about whether these different modes of writing history imply different periodizations, because, you know, again, in thinking about Spain, and this is an argument that literary historians have made about how history gets categorized, right? There's a real ideological value in skipping, you know, certain messy middles and foregrounding a connection, of course, to Rome and to a certain vision of Spain as directly, you know, connected to Rome. And are there similar things going on in a French context, so that doing one kind of history or the other implies a different, you know, sense of how you connect to those past, whether they're continuous or discontinuous, et cetera?
Absolutely. So to the second part, the answer is absolutely yes. And really couldn't be otherwise, you know, because it's a matter of assigning relevance, basically, and so that's going to give you a different kind of map of history of the past or different periods. But the first question of local history is an interesting one because, you know, I think local history gets much more assimilated to memorable history and memory. So it's local history that is important for a small group, but and this is why it's important for a small group, and it's addressed to that group to whom it's important. So this kind of tension between a history that is technically following your methodological rules, but is telling you things you don't want to hear. That requires a kind of a larger stage where different groups are going to be in conflict about ways of recording the past. So it's this, I think the situation of conflict is really important for the claims made for these methods. And this idea of correction, I think that correction of the past can be transferred onto correction of the other group. So, you know, in the same way that you could, that history is often denied to other national groups by certain national groups. So, you know, these people don't really have a history because, yeah, you know, we know this from a lot of travel literature and ethnography, that way of thinking about a group that isn't yours. And so the interesting thing in a situation, this is why I'm always returning to the French 16th century, because in a situation of civil war, you have this kind of division within unity that creates all these interesting conflicts, I think.
Thank you, Andrea, for that. There's one, I think we're going to take one more question and then wrap up, because on Zoom, everything is a little more effortful, and our speaker has been very patient. So this one is from Clément Godard. Thank you for the stimulating talk. Have you looked into practices of damnatio memoriae in 16th century Europe? I'm thinking, for example, of Francisco de' Medici, who not only ordered the killing of several exiled Florentines, Fioriciti in France, but also the destruction of their tombstones. I'm wondering if that specific practice was common during the wars of religion, and if it may, at least in part, explain the increasing partisanship of printed memorable histories.
Well, that's an interesting question. It wasn't really a practice. The thing about 16th century France is that there was such instability, governmental instability, power instability, that you didn't have anyone who really could enforce something like a decree of damnatio memoriae. You didn't have somebody that had that kind of power or position. And this is why let's say the majority party always had to deal with the history as it was written by the minority party. It was constantly being confronted with it. It couldn't be erased. And, a lot of us, it has to do with a confluence of circumstances where, we have the printing press, which is not yet regulated in the way it will be in the 17th century. We don't really have the kind of capabilities of censorship and control of print that will be developed later. So we just have this proliferation of discourse that cannot be ordered so easily according to some kind of imperial model or ducal model, if we're talking about Italy. Yeah, I'm sure that there would have been instances of damnatio memoriae if somebody could have pulled it off, but they couldn't.
Yes, and Jean-Claude Caron is going to finish us off on a dark note. But books, authors, publishers could also be burned, he points out. So,
yes, that's true. That is true.
Yeah. So, Jean-Claude's point makes me feel again the of course, we are just approximating the dialogue we wish we could have with you, where speakers could ask their own questions and respond to your responses. And again, my apologies for that, but I think this has been a wonderful approximation of having you with us and being able to have this conversation. So I would like to thank all our very active attendees, and of course, special thanks to Andrea for being here with us today. And we will invite you again once we can actually have you in a room and have these discussions. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. All of the Cosmopolitanisms talks for this year are going to be in this format. We encourage you to join us. And again, thank you to everyone for such a stimulating conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.